Good evening, everyone. My name is Fergal O'Keefe from MS Ireland. You're very welcome to the MS Ireland webinar series, The Unspeakable Bits. You're invited to submit down. You'll see a Q&A section down there at the bottom. So you're invited to put in your questions or comments into the bottom of the screen there during the talk. Please don't use the chat function, and then I'll put those questions through to our panel, and we try to get through as many as we can tonight during it. So our host, Trevis L. Gleason, is joined tonight by Eric Downer, who's Associate Professor in Human Health and Disease in Trinity College Dublin, and Dr. James Bowen, Director of Multiple Sclerosis Center at the Swedish Neuroscience Institute in Seattle. I'll hand you over to Trevis now, and best of luck. Thank you.
Thanks, Fergal, and hello and welcome to this next edition of the Unspeakable Bits. As Fergal said, I'm Trevis L. Gleason, your host, and we want to certainly thank MS Ireland for their support in giving us this platform to delve into topics that were once and well, frankly, still often are considered taboo, but are a real and important part of getting over, under, around, and through the challenges of living with this disease. As those of you who have been with us for a while now will know, we don't shy away from the difficult topics when it comes to MS or the questions on these programs. And for Ireland, and I suppose our international audience as well, the medical use of cannabis and its derivatives will come, I suppose, towards the top of that unspeakable pile. As Fergal said, we do invite you to submit questions to our panel tonight via the questions tab at the bottom of your screen. So don't use the chat function as was mentioned. Your questions will be put through to us, and we'll get to them, as many of them as we can tonight. But please remember that it would be inappropriate and medically unwise for our guests to answer any specific questions to any one person's medical condition. We have two highly regarded guests with us tonight to discuss the topic, and I thank Dr. Bowen and Professor Downer for being with us here. As a bit of I suppose a personal disclaimer, Dr. Bowen is the lead of my MS specializing team and has been since just a couple of months after I was diagnosed back in 2001. And if you don't mind, gentlemen, because of the international audience, I'm just going to use first names tonight, as Professor, Doctor, Mr. All of that could be a bit confusing for some of our audience. So you both know that we respect you highly, but is it all right if we keep it a bit informal tonight?
Yes, I'm good with informal.
Not too informal. I won't call anybody dude or anything. I suppose it's a good idea to remind our international listeners that while some of the specific laws that we talk about here tonight will be relative to Ireland, each jurisdiction will have their own take on such things. So make sure that you check with your local doctor, etc. And first, since we are talking about the subject of legal issues, and that will be high on the list of concerns, let me read just a portion of the position paper on cannabis-based medical products from MS Ireland. Now, I'm only reading a few small sections of this 6-page paper, so if you want to know the whole of MS Ireland's position paper, do get in touch with them. It states that MS Ireland has drawn a clear distinction between products such as Sativex that have undergone rigorous and efficacy and safety training to achieve regulatory approval, and non-pharmaceutical products that are not licensed for medical use. There are serious concerns about the safety and risk associated with unregulated, unstandardized non-pharmaceutical products containing cannabis extracts, in particular those that contain THC, the main psychoactive element in cannabis. MS Ireland strongly believes that through scientific research is the only way to demonstrate the effectiveness and safety of any particular MS therapy. It goes on to say that in addition to THC, cannabis contains a number of active ingredients which have observed to have a range of effects on the human body, including pain relief and anti-inflammatory properties. For this reason, cannabis and its compounds have long attracted attention of researchers interested in the potential benefits of the treatment and various conditions, including MS. In Ireland, cannabis is currently a Schedule I controlled drug under the misuse of drugs legislation, which makes it an offense to be in possession of cannabis or many of its extracts, including THC, and this includes medical products that contain those components. Currently, the Minister of Health can consider granting a license for access to medical cannabis for named patients, which is, of course, the action can be endorsed by the person's consultant, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And the paper concludes that MS Ireland advises that all treatment should be taken only following the consultation with medical professionals. So again, that's just a small part of that paper. And I do recommend, if you want to know the whole of MS Ireland's position on that, that you get in touch. I also want to read just the brief conclusion on medical marijuana, as it's known in America, from Dr. Alan Bowen's important book, Complementary and Alternative Medicines for and MS. He concludes that studies suggest that marijuana may decrease MS-associated spasticity. It also may be helpful for pain, sleep difficulties, and bladder difficulties. However, marijuana use is associated with significant side effects, and interactions are possible between marijuana and prescription medications. Further studies on the use of medical marijuana and marijuana-related chemicals in MS are needed. If marijuana is used for MS symptoms, the user should discuss this use with their physician. Users should be aware that marijuana use may be illegal, and as prescription medications for MS symptoms may be more effective than the use of marijuana. So those are just a few of the disclaimers and some of the medical notes that we wanted to get out of the way first. But even in those short snippets that I just read, there's a number of terms that mightn't be familiar with all of our viewers. So if we can, let's begin with something of a primer on medical cannabis. And I'm just going to throw this back and forth between the two of you, if you don't mind. So I'm going to start with the term for you, Eric, and you can just describe it to us. Cannabinoids.
Oh, thanks, Travis. Yeah, cannabinoids then is a general umbrella term really that takes into account different groups of compounds, right? So the main group of cannabinoids are phytocannabinoids. They're the plant-derived cannabinoids. So when I started working in this area like 20 years ago, there's about 60 or 70 of these identified in the plant. Now there's over 100 of those, or up to 150 of those even. So we're discovering new components or new phytocannabinoids all the time. The two that we know most about from research of phytocannabinoids are THC, which is tetrahydrocannabinol. That's the main euphoric component, and cannabidiol or CBD, which is a non-euphoric component. So they're phytocannabinoids. The second major group are the endocannabinoids or endogenous cannabinoids, and endogenous refers to within the body. So they're really fascinating because they're molecules that we produce in our bodies that act in a similar way to components of the plant. So two of the main ones of those are anandamide and 2-arachidonoglycerol. So they're synthesized abundantly in the body. They're highly expressed in the nervous system and the immune system. And they have many physiological effects that research is still trying to figure out. Why on earth do we have these cannabis-like molecules in our bodies? And what's their function? Can we therapeutically target them? And then we have synthetic cannabinoids, which are really, pharmacological tools that we can use in the lab, for example. On top of that, then there's many different, outside of, they're not strict cannabinoid compounds, but the cannabis plant has many different compounds within it. And one of those groups are terpenes or terpenoids, and they're becoming much more actively researched. They're what give the fragrance components to cannabis, but they're also present in various other foodstuffs. For example, limonene in the hemp plant is present in lemons, and this is quite an active area of research now, because data is starting to show that these may have therapeutic potential, these terpenes in the plant as well. So they're some of the main components of the plant, but cannabinoids refers to the phytocannabinoids, plant-derived cannabinoids, and endogenous cannabinoids, I guess, as well.
Right, Jim, a little bit more about those endocannabinoids, and because we're talking about produced in the brain in a lot of ways. You want to talk about that just a touch?
Yeah, it's probably shocking to some people to realize that we actually have receptors for cannabinoids in our bodies. And it's not because we're going around smoking marijuana the whole time, or it's because our body, as Dr. Downer mentioned, our body makes its own cannabinoids, and I think we really don't understand well what they are doing in there. But there's two types of receptors that the type 1 and type 2 receptor for cannabinoids, and type 1 receptor is found mostly in the nervous system, in the brain. And we don't know how our bodies really use this, but it's important to our normal physiology. Type 2 receptor, interestingly, is found mostly on the immune system, and is one of the most important receptors that turn down some of our immune system activity, especially with macrophages, or in the brain, macrophages are called microglial cells. And you can think of those cells as like the garbage disposal units of the immune system. They clean up debris, process material that's been destroyed and damaged. But they are, in fact, the ones that strip the myelin off of the axons in multiple sclerosis. So there's a long history in medicine of finding plants that have medicinal value, and then honing down on that and finding that, oh, these react with a receptor that's normal in the human body. You know, some examples people might be familiar with, or aspirin originally came from willow bark, and digoxin, which is a heart medicine, came from foxgloves. So this is another one where, you know, we started with a plant and then moved from the plant to find that we have receptors that react with that in our brains.
For the non-scientific, more the almost culinary, it's interesting. There's a book, and it's late in the evening here, so my brain isn't remembering the name of the author. It'll come to me, but The Botany of Desire is a wonderful book, and it talks about how 4 different plants evolved to meet certain desires of man, and the cannabis plant being one. We've got a request that I read. Talk about the complementary and alternative medicines and multiple sclerosis, which is by Dr. Alan Bowling, MD, PhD, for the person who's asked that question. Eric, you mentioned, I'm just going to say THC because of the hour, just a little bit about that particular cannabinoid, and that's the psychotropic one, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. That's the compound that we think gives the psychoactive or the euphoric effects associated with ingestion of cannabis per se. And as Dr. Bowen was saying, we think that THC will act at specific receptors within the body, particularly CB1 receptor, which is located within predominantly or abundantly within your central nervous system. So that will affect your different neuronal functions in the body. So that is still considered the primary euphoric component in the cannabis plant today. And
Jim, the synthetic reproductions, you talked about aspirin coming from willow bark, and now obviously it's not. The same with the foxglove. How are these synthetic reproductions of these cannabinoids made?
Well, there's a couple of ways to do it. The one that's just made chemically is Marinol in the States is the name for it, and that one is THC, and they just chemically make it in a factory, and it's approved in the United States, THC, for a couple of things. One is it helps with nausea and vomiting, especially related to chemotherapy. And then the other one is, not sure what the Irish term for this, but if you smoke a lot of cannabis, you get the munchies, which revs up your appetite, and so it's approved for AIDS patients that have anorexia, so they lose their appetite, lose a whole lot of weight, And it's approved for those two things in the States. But that one was, that's THC, which is the main component, the largest of the 150 or so cannabinoids.
Okay. And Eric, you mentioned CBD, which a lot of people will be aware of because it's relatively available in a lot of places. In oil form, usually you see it. What might that do?
Well, CBD is under intense investigation. It's different from THC because it's not considered a euphoric cannabinoid, but it acts it's quite CBD would be considered quite promiscuous, and what I mean by that is that it can act at various different sites and tissues and cells within the body. So this CBD acts at not predominantly, we think from research, at the cannabinoid receptors. It can act at different other various receptors across the body, and these are, for example, PPAR receptors or opioid receptors. So they may have different pharmacology compared to a compound such as THC. Now, the CBD has been developed as a therapeutic, a botanical pure CBD it is combined in Sativex, which you may talk about, and another drug called Epidiolex. And those drugs would be very different from CBD that we would all see in health food stores, for example. And there's various different reasons for that in terms of pharmaceutical grade compared to pharmaceutical grade therapeutic cannabinoids that have gone through clinical development, for example.
Okay. On that, the approval of Sativex is use in Ireland is probably something of the impetus for this program. And it's recently been approved in Ireland. Jim, as you'll know, it's been approved in North America over a very long time. Could you give us a brief background about that drug and its international approval? I believe it was in Canada first before it was approved in America, but I could be wrong there. And then we'll have Eric talk about maybe why it was so slow to be approved here in Ireland. So, Jim, if you want to start out about what it is and the approval process.
Yeah, so there's one other term, maybe I'll introduce the viewers to. So we got cannabinoids, endocannabinoids, THC. So nabiximols are the other one. And this applies to the case of Sativex or Sativex, depending on which side of the pond you're on. But nabiximols are an herbal preparation. The definition of it is an herbal preparation that contains a mixture of THC and cannabidiol, and it's got a bunch of other compounds in it, but it's a mixture that they extract from 2 strains of cannabis plants, and so they've standardized it and turned it into a drug. So it's extracted directly from the plant itself, and that's why it has a special name. So if you see nabiximol, that's what they're talking about with that. It's problematic. We'll probably get to this later, but it's the breeding of cannabis plants is rapidly evolving, and what you're actually getting in a product it's hard to know. So in the case of Sativex, they have standardized. It's always the same 2 plants. They test it for how much of each of these compounds are in it. And it has been studied in several well-designed phase 3 studies specifically for spasticity, and in the setting of multiple sclerosis. So you're right, the Canadians and some of the Europeans got out very early ahead of the pack and approved this. It is actually not approved in the US yet, and there are several reasons for that. One involves politics, where the FDA laws that oversee the FDA specifically exclude cannabis from it's listed as a Category 1 drug, as you mentioned earlier. I think we have the same categories on our side of the Atlantic. But the other problem from an American standpoint is that all of the patients that were in the studies were European or Canadian patients, and the FDA rules require that there be American patients. And it's not because Americans are so special physiologically. It's that there was concern several years ago within the States that there would be drugs that you might test in a third world country, and people volunteer their bodies to answer the question about the drug. And then when it gets approved, it's only used in a first world country like the US. So that's why they require Americans to have skin in the game, so that we're not taking advantage of third world populations to test our drugs on. There's now a study that's underway that does include Americans, and we're hoping that it will be approved at some point. So any American patient that uses this has to sneak it across the Canadian border at the present time.
All right. Well, so Eric, apparently Ireland's a little bit ahead of the US on this. So could you, again, this was approved in Canada, I don't know, 15 years ago, maybe. Why did it take so long? And I suppose, when can people with MS expect that their GPs and their consultants will be able to prescribe the medication here?
I don't know. All I do know is that, you know, this process was really initiated in Ireland, and I think it's probably fair to say by 2017, when at that time the Minister for Health commissioned a report from the Health Products Regulatory Authority in terms of the medical use of cannabis products. And based on that report, the minister recommended that cannabis-based medicines would be made available for a restricted set of conditions. So that was from 2017, and those restricted conditions, I'm sure a lot of the audience know, are very specific. You know, it's spasticity associated with MS, nausea and vomiting, so as an anti-emetic, and treatment-resistant epilepsy. And under this access program, which I think has been fair to say it's been very slow. I don't know the reason for that as a research scientist, but it seems to be not moving particularly well. But under that program, it would require a medical consultant or specialist doctor to apply on behalf of the individual. And I think as a scientist, you know, a cautious approach is always important. And I think that's probably in essence what the origins of the medical access program in Ireland was trying to do, is in terms of keeping an accurate, or create a log of beneficial effects and adverse events with access to such compounds. So I don't know whether that has contributed to some of the delays in this as well. There is the ministerial license option, as well, as far as I'm aware, and that's to access different products, and you apply for a medical practitioner for, again, I think for a restricted set of conditions. And as far as I understand, I think one of the synthetic THC compounds that Dr. Bowen was talking about can be applied for under the ministerial licensing program. So the delay, I can't answer why there is a delay, but certainly looking at this as a research scientist, you know, I do think the research data is quite strong around anti-inflammatory, antioxidant potential of botanical purified pharmaceutical grade cannabis therapeutics. And you know, the clinical trial data, as Dr. Bowen was saying, is very promising as well. So, and this isn't a new thing, you know, in terms of cannabinoid as a therapeutic, overall, it's been around, been documented for many, many years and for many centuries. It's not a new thing. It's dated back many centuries for use for pain relief and gout and malaria, for example. So it has really put in motion. I think a lot of hope was given from 2017 onwards, but it seems to be taking very small steps, if any, still moving forward. And the reasons for that, I think, I'm personally not aware of.
We've got a question that's come in from a man called John, wanting to know if either of you know which strains of cannabis are used in Sativex or in a medication called Tilray, or is that proprietary to the pharmaceutical companies?
I think it's proprietary. We know there's 2 strains, but I don't know what they are.
Yeah,
and Eric, the question about, so was this approved by the European Medicines Agency a while ago, and Ireland's just getting around to saying, okay, us too?
Yeah, so Sativex was, things like Sativex is approved by the EMA, for the European Medicines Agency. Epidiolex, which is the purest botanical CBD, which is synthesized, which is the development of that was led by the same company, Sativex, or Nabiximols and Epidiolex. Epidiolex, the CBD product, is FDA and EMA approved. So they have, in my view, these kind of botanical grade compounds are the way forward. These trying to answer a little bit about the question that's come in there. I do know that the plants that produce these compounds have been developed over many, many years with plant geneticists and botanists that have developed chemotypes and genetic strains of these plants. I've seen it. And they're grown under very strict climate conditions and control conditions and extracted in a very defined way. And it's those products that have gone through clinical trials and then received appropriate regulatory approval as being safe as well. So so that's why they've achieved FDA or EMA approval status. So I'm not aware of the legalities around approval and in the Irish system, and why it's coming down cul-de-sacs or is being delayed in many cases.
Jim, which specific, I suppose, MS symptoms could be helped by products like Sativex? You mentioned spasticity, but Dr. Bowling mentions sleep and bladder, etc. What are we looking at that this might help?
Yeah, the symptoms, we know most about spasticity because when you study a drug, you have to pick some symptom, and then you get your drug on the market and it's approved for that symptom that you studied. So good evidence regarding spasticity, but there's a number of other things that people tell us that it might help, and certainly sleep and anxiety may help with those things. Pain, people take it for pain. There was a recent study that it may even help with bladder symptoms, but all of those have not really been formally studied. And part of it is that there's not pharmaceutical money behind it to push, but also it's just getting it through the regulatory process for all these other uses. We haven't even gotten it through for spasticity in the States, so it's been challenging. It might help the viewers to know also that we don't have a good feel for which of these 150 cannabinoids are the ones that are most active. And one of my patients lent me a book for only 2 weeks, then they wanted it back, but it had 150 strains of cannabis listed These are all medical strains, and it had a table in the back of the book that you could just pick your symptom. I have spasticity and pain, and not just MS, all sorts of different diseases. And so you could cross-tabulate and figure out which of these 150 strains might be the best for you. And all these strains are bred, plant breeders just, breed them, trying to target a strain that might help particular symptoms. But on a scientific basis, we have no idea what's actually in, what makes one strain different than another as far as these cannabinoids are concerned. So by the time I finished the book 2 weeks later, the strains are outdated. They're constantly coming up with new ones, but it's probable that different cannabinoids might affect different symptoms for a patient. And right now we have no way to predict on a scientific basis what is causing this symptom or that symptom to get better.
Erica, is there any research that is accepted here in Ireland about the use of non-synthesized cannabinoids? In other words, the tinctures or the cannabis herb in edibles or smoking, etc. Is there any research that's accepted at this point in Ireland?
In Ireland, there's a few cannabinoid research groups. Like in Trinity here, we work on plant-derived cannabinoids. So we work on compounds, botanically derived THC and CBD, and we publish data on those and their anti-inflammatory effects. And we work now currently on different terpenes as well. Because as Dr. Bowen said, a compound such as Sativex it's not just THC and CBD. There's other components within that product as well. It's quite difficult to actually extract THC alone from a plant product without contaminants within it. There is, in University of Galway, there is a research groups that work on the endogenous cannabinoid system. That's a very active research groups there, actually. And so they've been investigating how we can modulate the endocannabinoid system. And there's a selection of metabolizing enzymes that break them down. So you can target them with drugs to switch those off. That will boost endogenous tone of endocannabinoids in our bodies, because they're synthesized on demand and they're broken down very quickly. So if we can boost the endogenous levels of those, there's a body of research thought that thinks that may have therapeutic efficacy then. So that's what some of the other research in Ireland is looking at. I'm not aware though of research labs within Ireland, and I may be wrong, but I'm not aware of any other research labs in Ireland looking at cannabis herb as a research area per se, and would be just looking at more isolated pure cannabinoids, and then other groups looking at endogenous cannabinoids as well.
As I'd mentioned, Dr. Bowen has been my neurologist in America for a long time, and we catch up whenever we can. I'll tell a little bit of a story. Just so I was living in the Seattle area at the time, and was I'll be frank, I was at a party, and I had one particular symptom. It had to do with a lesion around my cervical spine, and we'd never been able to through pharmaceutical medications take care of that symptom. And what would happen is, when that was inflamed, anytime I moved my neck inside, it sounded like I was crunching down on the cartilaginous keel bone of a chicken breast. It was awful, and it was painful. And I noted that evening that symptom, which I was experiencing, just sort of went away. And the next time I saw Dr. Bowen, I mentioned this because it was interesting to me. And at the time in Washington State, it was legal for medical use, and MS was one of the conditions. So he said, I was very surprised. He said, "Well, I can write you a prescription for that." And so he did, and I went to one of these medical dispensaries, and you're absolutely right, Jim. The people there knew exactly which strains were going to help me with each one of the things that I was talking about. But it must be said that for a guy who I often call MS an iceberg disease, that people outside see about 10% of what I'm experiencing. So for the most part, externally, I'm just a guy with a walking stick, and I walk into this room, and there were AIDS patients, and there were chemotherapy patients that were undergoing cancer treatment. There were horrendous burn victims and car crash survivors. And I looked around, and then I thought to myself, my God, if the state of Washington says I can use this, how sick am I really? And it was kind of it was a blow to the solar plexus, really. But it must be said that the people who were doing that were very, very passionate about it, and they were very strict in how they kept to the law, etc. But yeah, the number of strains that they were able to say, all right, this will help you with sleep, and this will help you with this, but not put you to sleep, and this one you'll get the THC is lower, and this will be better. They really were. Again, I know it wasn't scientific, this was anecdotal, but I can say from my experience with those couple of dispensaries that I used that it really did work. Now, ever since moving to Ireland and now hoping to be on the citizenship ladder, of course, I have not used any cannabis herb, because it would just, if I got caught with that, they were not going to let me be a citizen. But I just wanted everyone to know out front that I have had that experience, etc. And we certainly want to invite anybody who has questions to send them in. Someone is actually sending in the question about CBD, and if there is any sort of clinical register of scale of potency or whatever, and if there is a better one to use. Eric, I'm going to throw you to that one. Is there even a rating scale on the strength of CBD when it comes to over-the-counter products, I guess we'll call them, consumer products?
Yeah, well, I guess like I have to try to answer this in a sensitive way, I guess, right? So I think the CBD that over the counter, in my view, it's very different from products such as Epidiolex. Epidiolex is a pure CBD, botanical CBD product, and if you compare such products, Epidiolex versus over-the-counter CBD in a health food store, they're not the same thing. The Epidiolex has been produced through these specific genetic lines of chemotypes to produce these plants over many years in cases, to extract an isolated product in a defined way, and that's gone through clinical trial, huge research, and preclinical research, and then received regulatory approval. So that's how they can make a health claim related to it, where the CBD in a health food store should not, as far as I'm aware, make a health claim. And there are regulatory concerns regarding some of those products in terms of THC within them, because as I mentioned earlier, it's difficult to extract cannabinoids in a pure form without contaminants from other components of the plant. They're very lipophilic molecules, which makes them difficult to study actually, but difficult to extract in pure form as well, without contaminants within it. So that's why there's been regulatory concerns regarding, I think, some over-the-counter CBD products with potential of THC within them, which is illegal in Ireland.
And there's another question that's coming through that I'll give to you, Eric, having to do with driving while using Sativex because of the extraction process, etc. Could someone get in trouble driving on that medication?
So with Sativex, right? So when you look at the research data on it, right? Sativex is taken as a sublingual spray, and if you look at the published data on the pharmacological profile of Sativex versus someone that's taking cannabis or smoking cannabis per se, the pharmacological profile in the body, what I mean by that is the levels of THC, for example, in the body are very different, right? So if someone ingests or smokes cannabis per se, they have a large plasma peak, a large blood peak in THC, and that's associated then with the euphoric effect. But compounds like Sativex do not have that classic pharmacological profile of a THC peak that's linked to psychoactivity. So the published data is not showing clear psychoactivity or euphoric effects associated with Sativex, which as a research scientist, I would endorse, because I think there's lots of beneficial effects of this plant that we can harness, and we can bypass psychoactivity or the negative connotations around components of this plant. Now, I'm trying to think in terms of, I think it's outlined on GW Pharmaceuticals leaflet for the product, but I do know it's contraindicated for pregnancy, for breastfeeding, and I think it's recommended to not operate machinery or drive actually when using that product. But I would recommend that the listener would read the leaflet associated with that, which is available and publicly available as well, to get that information.
All right, we'll ask Fergal to put up maybe a link to that as well, because there are some questions about if there are any contraindications for other MS medications, et cetera. So we'll ask for that. But that's on who's the manufacturer? You mentioned GW.
GW Pharmaceuticals, yeah.
Okay.
Who are now part of Jazz Pharmaceuticals.
Okay, Jim. When I was talking there about the medical dispensaries, et cetera, is there, or I suppose it's a plant, and I mean, hell, if I plant 2 different kale seeds, I get 2 different products, it seems. Is there would there be a big difference now that, for instance, Seattle, Washington State is a recreational marijuana state as well? Is there a difference between medical grade or dispensary herb cannabis and what might be called the street version of marijuana?
Yes. So in Washington State, we us and Colorado were the first 2 states to legalize recreational marijuana, and we actually passed our law first, but it took a while to implement it, so Colorado actually beat us to the implementation. But prior to that, we were only approved for medical marijuana, and now it's medical and recreational. And the biggest difference is recreational people want a lot of THC because that's what makes you high. And then most medical people do not want THC because not that many MS patients want to get high because they're already having enough problems without being high on top of it. So the strains of plant that they use are often quite different. You might want THC, as I was saying earlier, if you have severe weight loss because you have cancer or chemotherapy or things like that. But for the most part, medical uses a lot more CBDs. And then, as I was saying, it's this weird mixture that we don't understand what the components are of, whatever these 150 cannabinoids are. When it was only medical, there were a number of medical marijuana places in the greater Seattle market, which is about 2 million people. We had about 150 dispensaries in the Seattle area for that many people. And you would go in and tell the dispensary what your symptoms were, and they would try to work with you to find out a plant, and then they would adjust. You tell them it either worked or I didn't like this, and they would adjust, the strain of the plant. Once it went recreational, the number of dispensaries that sell the marijuana have dramatically decreased. Statewide, there's more of them, but in the Seattle market, they've consolidated into a fewer number of larger ones. And they have strongly swung toward recreational because there are more sales in recreational. So the diversity of plant strains has diminished since it went recreational. More shelf space for the recreational, less shelf space in the stores for the medical. One thing we're wrestling with right now is medical marijuana is tax-free, but recreational marijuana has a very high tax. It's something like 100% tax on it. And so now we're having a rash of like a medical epidemic of people that are trying to get permits that allow them to avoid the taxes on it. So there's debate in the state legislatures about whether we should just tax it all or not tax it all. Anyway, that's been a challenge that we're dealing with.
All right. I've got one person asking a question in confirming Sativex is a not a disease modifying therapy. This is just for symptoms. So we do know that one, Annette. And Eric, we mentioned the Medical Cannabis Access Program, or MCAP, when I read MS Ireland's position paper in advance of the program. And even tonight, we're hearing from a few people who are approved under that program who have said that they've been able to reduce some of their pain and spasticity medications because they were approved to use medical cannabis. Might you illuminate us a bit on how that program works, if you're aware of it? Or maybe doesn't work.
No, I see what some of the comments here. I just want to reiterate that I'm a neuroscientist. I'm a research scientist. I'm not a legislator or involved in any way in regulatory approval or processing with the H-PRA drugs. I'm a biological research scientist who work on the understanding the effects of the compounds on the body. So I'm not involved in any way in the legislation or development of those products. So I just responding to one of the comments there in the chat.
All right, Jim, what are some of the potential side effects or dangers with cannabis herb versus the synthesized prescriptions or the tinctured prescriptions?
Yeah, well, that's been one of the problems is in the US and probably much of the rest of the world, we've been unable to research this because the laws which have been in place since the late 1930s have just labeled it that you can't study it. And it's possible to do studies on cannabis, but all of the cannabis that you could do a research study on in the States has to come from one farm in Mississippi, and it's 1970s strain of marijuana. So high THC, but relatively low potency to what you can buy on the street. That law was just changed about 2 years ago, but it has not been implemented yet. So we really have no scientific knowledge. The best knowledge that we have comes from Marinol, which is THC, which is licensed for sale in the U.S. as a pharmaceutical. And the things that they list on the label are that if you already have bipolar disease or depression or schizophrenia, it can make those worse. It doesn't cause them. You have to have those diseases to start with. Another one which would surprise no one is that you can get stoned on it. They call it altered mental status, but people take THC to get stoned. And then rare cases of low or high blood pressure and seizure. There's some question about substance abuse, whether it might exacerbate if you have a substance abuse disorder, but the old notion that this is a gateway drug and leads to the use of harder drugs is not believed anymore. And then the final thing is that, THC we prescribe sometimes for nausea and vomiting from chemotherapy and stuff, but there is an occasional paradoxical effect that it can worsen nausea and vomiting. It usually takes a person that's using massive amounts, but it can happen. But those are the side effects we know about, but it has not been systematically studied in most cases.
Eric, I know you're not a legislator, and I appreciate you pointing that out for everyone as well, because there are so many different aspects. You're a researcher. But from that side of it, would you see any concerns ahead if more medical cannabis products were more widely available on the market like they are in America? Or would you perhaps, and some of them aren't available in America, but I'm thinking more of the herb there, or do you think that in your research, do you believe that there's a lot of potential in the research there for treating other MS symptoms and then other conditions beyond that?
Yeah, so now, at present, our research is coming from a therapeutic angle as an anti-inflammatory effects of these compounds at a cellular level. So we would take blood samples, some people with MS and non-MS control cases, and take them back to the lab here in Trinity, and then we isolate the circulating immune cells from those individuals, and we put them into a culture system, which are Petri dishes here in the lab. And then what we find is that an immune cell from an MS individual versus a non-MS control is switched on, it's inflamed. So we then add different cannabinoid or different drugs onto those cells, and we see that it's switching off inflammation. So that's what we're doing now, but I do have two sides of viewing this as well, because when I did my PhD in this 20 years ago, I looked at damaging effects of cannabis on the brain, and particularly THC. And that was all through animal research, actually. And we found that the neonatal brain was susceptible to damage from THC more so than the adult brain. And we thought that may contribute to some of the neurobehavioral deficits that occur in children exposed to cannabis in utero, actually. So I've got these two views of the whole plant. You know, I am aware of some of the damaging effects of components of it as well. And that's why I think it's welcome I do welcome where we hear that medicinal based cannabinoids are contraindicated in pregnancy or in breastfeeding, because they do have many different physiological effects on the nervous system and modulate a number of neurotransmitter systems, for example, in the body. But as I said earlier, you know, cannabis herb is very different from a pharmaceutical product in terms of its pharmacology. There's always caution needs to be taken, I think, and that's speaking as a research neuroscientist, you know, because the data is pretty clear that cannabis use per se at certain times of life is linked to psychosis. I think the data is quite strong on that. But when you read the data about the clinical trial data on products such as Sativex and read the adverse events associated with them, there are things like dizziness or mouth ulcers or tiredness, you know, so I think that's probably, you know, quite a positive aspect in looking at this. But again, probably caution, because we don't know the long-term effects, I would say, of someone taking a medicinal cannabis product also. You know, so I think a correct scientific approach is to create an accurate log of positive and negative effects. But, you know, I think, again, led by research data, I'm always thinking about research data, you know, that when you look at the Sativex data, there's no withdrawal when people come off medication. There's no tolerance or clear dependence associated with the use of such medication, and no significant psychoactivity associated with the therapeutic doses of Sativex. So, you know, I think I've got two views of it, but I think, you know, in terms of the therapeutic cannabinoids like Sativex, Epidiolex, you know, the pros, you know, there are a lot of beneficial effects that probably outweigh the negative effects of it. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer.
No. We set aside a full hour to talk about this, and we are actually coming toward the end of that hour. So I'm going to ask both of you if you've got any final thoughts on medical cannabis that you'd like to leave our audience with. And Dr. Bowen, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would add that we haven't covered just yet is how you take it. And I think most people think about cannabis as smoking, and you know, as a doctor, we don't like smoking, and that's probably like the worst way that you could take it. The advantage of smoking is that it's very fast, so it actually kicks in just a few seconds, and you would have your maximal effect within maybe 15 minutes. So it's very easy to adjust your dose with smoking. Vaping is slightly slower, but also it's still extremely fast. But just in a minute or two, you're starting to have an effect. In 15, 20 minutes, you know the maximal effect, so you can adjust your dose. But there are we know a lot of bad things about smoking, but vaping, there's a lot of lung problems and lung disease that people are having that way. The other one is to take it sublingually or with a spray. So this would be like a eyedropper that you would put under your tongue, or the spray like Sativex is a spray. That one is fairly fast. It's absorbed right through your mouth, and it would take about 15 minutes. So it's a short enough time that you could figure out the dose and figure out what's the right dose for you, and fairly fast, but not as fast as the vaping. And then the last two would be orals, so edibles. And those are much slower in onset. So the time of onset is about an hour to an hour and a half that you would notice any impact on it. And then the maximal effect may be 3 hours later. So it's much harder to adjust your dose on the fly if you were doing it that way. One other thing I would add is that if you take it orally, or if you take it like with a cream or something on the lower, kind of mid-chest down, it's absorbed into the bloodstream from either your gut or your skin, and it goes from there directly to the liver, which destroys about 90% of the dose. And that's why the spray or the under the tongue drops works better, because that actually goes straight to your brain first, and then the liver second. So it's it's less of a dose that you need. And back to the other question who asked, well, how much CBD, how many milligrams? That's what makes it hard, because the milligrams you would take sublingually or in with a spray would be much less than what you would do with an edible or something. All
right. Eric, any final thoughts for us?
Yeah, I think I'll just say that, when we think about I've been asked about the MCAP, the medical access program tonight, that's policymakers. Policymakers don't engage with scientists. They don't talk to us about the cannabinoid science. So I personally would get annoyed when I read articles about medical cannabis, or sometimes how it's reported in the media, because quite often we don't hear about Sativex or in the media, or medicinal therapeutic cannabinoids, which we've been talking about. So I think it's important that, more dialogue is taking place between policymakers and researchers. And, that would hopefully lead to more funding for basic research, because, research in Ireland and across the world is chronically underfunded. And that's the only way we're going to understand these different components of this complex plant and harness those beneficial effects of it. And then this is an educational thing as well, because educating policymakers about cannabinoid science, the public, which is what this is great for doing as well, but also, dare I say, clinicians. They're front line as a neurologist in accessing cannabinoid-based therapeutics. So I would question the general knowledge sometimes around cannabinoid-specific science for a lot of clinicians as well. So that's would be my final point. I think there's a lot of, hopefully it's clear to the listeners that there's a lot of potential benefits within this plant. We're only scraping the surface of what we know about it. And we're only going to know more about it by funding more research and funding research scientists to investigate it in more detail.
Well, there's a call to action for anyone who is interested in this. Then the next time that a politician or a party member calls to the garden gate, it's time to have that conversation. Or if you're going to a local clinic with a TD, make sure that you're bringing this up if you want to know more. As I expected we would, our time is quickly gone. You've answered a lot of questions, and I thank you so very much. I suspect there'll be a sequel to this. Until then, however, I want to extend my greatest thanks to our guests, Professor Eric Downer from Trinity College Dublin and Dr. James Bowen of the Swedish Neurological Institute in Seattle. We're going to be taking a couple of months off this summer. The Unspeakable Bits will be back at the end of September when we hope you'll join us again. And in the meantime, if you have any suggestions for Unspeakable Bits topics, please do drop those to us and we'll see if we can't get to them. I see Fergal's back on. So until we see you in September, I'm Trevis L. Gleason, wishing you and your family the best of health. Cheers. Back to you, Fergal.
Just to let you know that we recorded this webinar like we recorded all the ones over the last few months, and they will be available. The previous ones are already available on our website, and this will be available in the next couple of weeks. So you can go onto the MS Ireland YouTube channel and they'll all be available there. And just to keep an eye on social media over the next few months, when we let you know back in September, we'll be coming back again. So just keep an eye out on that for the next ones. And finally, I just want to thank Eric and Jim for giving us their time this evening and such a great informative talk. I'm sure people found it as powerful as that we found. So, you know, as I said, I'm sure this is a topic, we've only touched on it tonight, that we'll come back to again. So again, and particularly Trevis, I want to thank you for the last few months for all of these webinars. They've been really, really helpful. So take care, everybody. Good night, and hopefully we'll see you again soon in the autumn.
Cheers.